Good evening again. Tonight's talk is The Nature of Inequality. It's part of the ongoing Project 6050 here at Michigan State University and part of the Honors College Sharper Focus Wider Lens Forum. I'm Cynthia Jackson Elmore, the Dean of the Honors College, and I'd like to welcome all of you here with us in the room, as well as those joining us through live stream with the MSU Alumni Association. Our sponsors for tonight, in addition to the Honors College, include the College of Education, the College of Social Science, the Departments of Economics, Psychology, and Teacher Education, the School of Social Work, and the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives. I'll introduce each of our panelists tonight in the order that they're speaking, and also give you a hint of what they may discuss, and then from there, we'll allow them each to speak. We do brief talks from each of the panelists, then we have a little bit of crosstalk up here, and then we open it up to you in the audience as soon as possible because we really want your input and discussion. Speaking first tonight will be Charles Ballard. He's a professor in the Department of Economics in the College of Social Science. He served as a consultant with the U.S. Departments of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, and Treasury, and with research institutes in Australia, Denmark, and Finland. His books include Michigan at the Millennium and Michigan's Economic Future. In 2007, it says Charles, but I know him as Charlie. So Charlie became director of the State of the State Survey in Michigan State University's Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. And in that same year, he won the Outstanding Teacher Award in the College of Social Science. In 2011, he joined the board of directors of the Michigan League for Public Policy, and he earned his doctorate from Stanford University. To my immediate right is Nicole T. Buchanan. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, also in the College of Social Science. Nicole is a licensed clinical psychologist who teaches social justice and multicultural psychology. Her research focuses on the intersections of gender and race ethnicity with an emphasis on the harassment targeting African Americans and Latina women. Her research publications examine racialized sexual harassment, race and gender-based harassment among college students and working adults, race and gender role ideology as moderators of harassment and outcomes among white and Black women, contra-power harassment in academia, gendered bullying, and therapeutic concerns of racially ambiguous and non-visible minority women. Nicole is part of the Research Consortium on Gender-Based Violence here at MSU, which provides a collaborative, multidisciplinary vehicle for faculty and students to engage in social action research that influences significant local, state, national, and international practice and policy related to gender-based violence. She earned her doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. To my immediate left is Django Paris. He's an associate professor of language and literacy in the Department of Teacher Education in the College of Education. He is also a core faculty member in the African American and African Studies program in the College of Social Science, and affiliated faculty in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures in the College of Arts and Letters. His teaching and research focus on understanding and sustaining languages, literacies, and literature among youth of color in changing urban schools and communities. He is particularly concerned with educational and cultural justice as outcomes of inquiry and pedagogy. And I'm not sure if he and Charlie knew that they were alums together. His doctorate is also from Stanford University. Angie Kennedy is an associate professor and director of the doctoral program in the School of Social Work in the College of Social Science. Her work focuses on cumulative victimization, including community and school violence, family violence, and intimate partner violence, and associated outcomes among adolescents and youth adults. She is especially interested in using innovative methods to examine patterns of co-occurring and cumulative victimization over time. She has expertise in both quantitative and qualitative methods. Angie is also part of the research consortium on gender-based violence here at MSU and earned her doctorate from the University of Illinois at Chicago. To my far left is Paulette Granberry Russell, Senior Advisor to the President for Diversity and Director of the Michigan State University Office for Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives. Paulette facilitates and monitors effective strategies to advance a diverse and an inclusive university. She plays a vital leadership role on all campus inclusion and intercultural support committees and leads efforts in the office's 4 functional areas, which include institutional equity, education and development, community outreach, and research and assessment. Paulette is a licensed attorney in Michigan, earning her Juris Doctorate from the Thomas M. Cooley Law School. And on tonight, we may hear our panelists talk about several things, including income inequality and political explanations or the policy implications of them, looking at the 1% versus everyone else, and voting based on social issues and not economic ones. It's possible that Charlie may illuminate those topics. Nicole may talk with us about implicit bias, what it means, and microaggressions, and teaching social justice to dismantle the injustice. And when I allude to what they may talk about, there's a planning meeting where the panelists get to toss around ideas and see how it gels, and these are some of the topics that come out. But we give them leeway to go wherever they want. It's not their job to make the connections, it's actually my job. So I have to stay on my toes up here. Django may talk about racialized inequality in K through 12, the curriculization of racism, and changing demographics in the classroom and who is the teacher. Angie may discuss cumulative disadvantage, cycle of victimization and poverty, and resilience. And Paulette will speak about Black women's voices. And I also have to say hello to my co-collaborator, John Beck, who unfortunately is stuck in DC in the snow and watching us via live stream. He usually has good zinger questions from the audience, so we're counting on you guys to have really, really good stumping questions, because we won't have John to throw a couple zingers in there. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Charlie.
We get 8 minutes, correct?
That's correct.
My 8 minutes won't start until I've got this up, right?
That's correct.
Okay, there we go. From beginning. All right. Good evening. I'm glad that I was asked to join you here. This is going to be a fun evening. The inequality comes in many flavors, many varieties, and I think before the evening is done, we will have talked about many of them. I'm going to focus primarily on one that economists have spent more time thinking about than any other, which is income inequality. And survey research evidence suggests that most Americans are aware that there's been a large increase in income inequality in the last 40 years. It's what I consider the biggest economic story in my lifetime in the US economy. So it's encouraging that about 70% of Americans respond to surveys by saying that they know that that happened. Raise your hands if you're aware that there's been an increase in income inequality. Well, good, so we're doing better than the general public. What I think is, but it is distressing that 30% don't know that that's happened. What I think a lot of people don't know is that there was an equally large equalization, an equally large decrease in income inequality, mostly in the 30s and 40s. So here, there are many ways to slice the data, but here's as good as any. And this shows the percent of all the income in the United States that goes to the top 1% of households. And it goes back all the way to 1913. And this is 1928. That's the run-up of the stock market that led to a crash the following year and to the Great Depression. But if you sort of average out a century ago, the top 1% maybe was getting 18% of the total income. And then in the 30s and 40s and on even into the 70s, an amazing compression. Some economists call it the Great Compression. A huge equalization. The share of the top 1% went from about 18% to about 9%. A huge, and don't cry too much for the top 1%. They still were able to make it through the winter. But the bottom 99% did a whole lot better. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, it turned around, and now we're at a level of inequality in recent years that is a little bit more than the level of inequality of a century ago. The difference between this and this is about $1 trillion a year. Not $1 trillion over a generation, but $1 trillion a year. So this is a very, very, very substantial disequalization. Now, you might think, we'll tonight have a lot of discussion about women and minorities. So you might think, okay, women and African Americans, two groups traditionally marginalized in the American economy, you might think, okay, there's this big widening of the gap. Maybe that meant that those groups did badly. That actually did not happen. That's not where we can find the explanation. Here is, or at least not directly, here is the median woman's earnings as a percent of the median man's earnings over a 40-year period, and it went from 58% to 78%. Not at par yet, but a very substantial narrowing of the gap. For African Americans, a more mixed picture, but certainly not one of consistent losses. In fact, if I had been giving this talk 15 years ago, I would have talked about the fabulous gains of African Americans. They've lost some ground in the last 15 years. Note also that the South, where about 55% of black Americans live, used to be below, the ratio of blacks to whites in the South used to be below the ratio of blacks to whites for the rest of the country. It's now higher. It's in the South that African Americans have made by far their greatest gains. So if women and blacks, if something having to do with those are not the primary explanations, what are the explanations? Well, with the time that I have, I'm not going to be able to go into great detail. So what I have just listed is probably the top 8. There are others, but I think these are the top 8 reasons, and what I give them in order of my assessment of their importance to the disequalization. What's remarkable is that every one of these is exactly the 7 of the 8. The one exception is immigration, which almost didn't exist at all in the 30s and 40s. But all of the others, you've had all of these things moving together to equalize in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and then reversing direction and moving together to disequalize in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and on. And I hope that in the subsequent discussion, there is time to say a few more about these phenomena. But there they are on the screen. You can read them. Maybe we'll have time to talk about them in a few minutes. But given the shortness of the time, I want to get directly to what I consider are the underlying causes, which are political. In other words, the equalization of the 30s and 40s and the disequalization of the last 40 years did not happen as a result, or did not primarily happen as a result of impersonal economic forces. It happened it was what Americans voted for. If you voted for Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, you voted implicitly for a set of policies that helped the 99% a lot. And what has won elections in the last 40 years is policies that have helped the top 1% a lot. Then that leads to a big question, because the bottom 99% outnumber the top 1%, in fact, by a ratio of 99. And so, since we have elections, the question is, how For this to have happened, it has to be that in the last 40 years, large numbers of middle and low-income Americans have to have voted against their economic interests. And I'm going to list the 5 reasons that have been put forth. Thomas Frank, in his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, says people vote against their economic interests because they are greatly concerned about social issues, primarily abortion. And so the Republican Party, conservatives generally, are anti-abortion, so you vote with the anti-abortion candidate, even though that candidate will hurt you economically. Political organization, certainly. The rich and the business community got organized starting in the late 50s, going on into the 60s, 70s, 80s. Electoral institutions, we can say a lot about those. Ours is, for instance, the only country in which, in 2000, the person who got the second most popular votes in the presidential election would be elected president. No other country has a system like that. And the person who got the second most electoral votes in 2000, George W. Bush, pursued policies that were much more favorable to the top 1% than his opponent probably would have. Larry Bartels of Princeton says that it's voter ignorance. Voters are stupid. My problem with that is you have to explain, how is it that voters were smart in the 30s and 40s and then suddenly became stupid in the 70s and 80s? Moreover, how can to go with this one, you have to say, okay, everybody was smart in the 30s and 40s, and then in the 70s and 80s, white voters got stupid, but black voters maintained an ability to vote for their economic interests. And so I think we'll be talking about race a lot this evening, but my rough view is that all of these explanations are important. But I think the one that may have tipped the balance is that a segment of the white electorate, not a majority of the white electorate, but a segment of it, has been voting against its economic interests for the last 40 years as a reaction against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I've probably overgone my time. Oh, but only by 37 seconds. That was really close. Okay.
Thank you, Charlie.
I realize that many of you are probably already aware of explicit bias, that kind of old-fashioned bigotry like racism and sexism, where people will consciously hold opinions, make comments, and engage in behaviors that convey their attitudes and their beliefs about various social hierarchies. The good news, this kind of bias has been steadily decreasing over the last 50 years. But if explicit bias and overt prejudice really are decreasing, why is it we see these widening gaps or continued gaps in social inequalities among groups like the ones that we'll be talking about today? The reason, I believe, is because there's a second kind of bias at play here, and this type of bias is far more insidious. What I'm referring to is called implicit bias. This is a type of bias that impacts who we are and who we will develop to become before we even have conscious awareness that it exists. In fact, preschoolers are already able to articulate and act on social hierarchies related to gender and race, despite the fact that most of us adults think that we're hiding them from this information. Implicit bias reflects our unconscious associations, those associations that lead us to believe that certain kinds of people are more moral, good, kind, while other kinds of people are perhaps less so. But developing implicit bias is not pathological. It's not even malicious. It's actually a very normal brain function. Our brains simplify the over 11 million pieces of data that we have to process every single second by categorizing it, simplifying it, organizing it, and then automating it. When pieces of information are consistently paired together over time, Things like dark skin equals bad or dangerous. Our brains simply make those associations automatically, and they do it without our conscious awareness that they're doing so. And this is why we can develop implicit bias without actually having awareness of doing so, and we can have bias in ways that contradict what we actually believe, we think, and feel about others. And we can do this even if we're members of those very same marginalized groups. So we all develop implicit bias, and this is because every single day we're inundated with dozens, if not hundreds, of messages that pair groups of people with a variety of messages and images about things like intelligence, safety, work ethic, morality. So we can no more hope to emerge from this deluge without bias than we can hope to walk through the center of a thunderstorm without getting wet. But perhaps the most important problem is that unconscious associations influence our behaviors. And because implicit bias is unconscious, we have little control over it. We often have no idea that it's influenced our beliefs, and certainly very little awareness that it's influenced the way we treat other people. For these reasons, we all need a renewed commitment to addressing implicit bias. And it's not because it's the right thing to do or the charitable thing to do to help those poor marginalized people over there, but because implicit bias is inherently harmful to all parties, whether you're a member of a marginalized group or a member of a privileged group. We all pay the price for holding these kinds of biases. And we pay the price with our basic humanity, our ability to feel empathy for others, our ability to find connection in other human beings and with one another. And this is because we are all harmed. So we all have to have a stake in making this better. I'll give you a quick example related to college. We have evidence that increased diversity in educational settings, teaching students how to understand difference and be competent in talking and dealing with difference across people, that this breeds academic excellence for all students. Students that are reared in classrooms that have diversity have a variety of beneficial effects. They show increased cognitive flexibility, better problem solving, improved creativity, improved communication skills, and we send them into the world as more effective leaders. Yet, implicit bias and the daily experiences of diverse faculty and students diminish their full participation in these very settings. This is a Facebook post from an MSU student, if you can read it. As an example, students of color report feeling unwelcome in college classrooms. They're assumed to be intellectually inferior, they're passed over for group projects, they're subjected to negative comments about their groups and their communities. And diverse faculty, particularly female faculty of color, report feeling marginalized, having their knowledge and their credentials continuously questioned by students and their colleagues, and feeling as if they're not valued within the institution or by their fellow faculty members. When this happens, marginalized students and faculty will often disengage. Many even consider, and often do, leave their current institutions, perhaps even their field of study, perhaps their career path. And because they do this because they can no longer tolerate the constant deluge of negative experiences related to implicit bias. And this is important to all of us because this costs all of our students, the marginalized and the privileged. It costs them the benefits that I've already named related to diversity in education. But more good news. We can change our implicit biases. We can change our likelihood of acting on those implicit biases. First of all, we have to be accountable and take responsibility on learning our own bias. We have to challenge it. We have to bring it to conscious awareness. And we have to do this by asking ourselves certain questions, like, what evidence do I have that this bias I've developed is actually true? Perhaps more importantly, what evidence do I have that can disconfirm this paired association I've learned over time? And here at an institution of higher learning, I believe we have a special obligation to address bias because we are shaping the world's future leaders. This makes it incumbent upon us to address our own bias and to become skilled in how to talk about these issues in our classes, whether we're teaching an engineering class, an economics class, or a class in social science. It's in our classes that students become marginalized and turn away from key professions. It's in our classes where students feel they're not welcome in our ivory tower. And it's in our classes where students decide that colleges do not welcome their perspectives nor their presence. Conversely, we also have power. We have power to reverse this trend. We have the power to decide that we will educate to minimize implicit bias. We have the power to educate ourselves on how to facilitate these conversations within our classrooms, our faculty meetings, and our staff meetings. And we have the power to decide that we're not going to passively wait for the opportunity to come, that instead, we're going to seek out opportunities to dismantle implicit bias. We can take responsibility for transforming our futures. And we can do so by sending students into the world that are ready for the rapidly changing and increasingly diverse workplaces in the US and abroad, students that are culturally competent, and students that can interact in a truly inclusive manner, which is going to be necessary for the future world we're all facing. These are the kinds of leaders that we want to emerge from our classrooms here at MSU and across the nation. But they won't be able to do so if we don't teach them how to challenge their own implicit bias. And we do this by first challenging our implicit bias as instructors, as an institution, as leaders for the next generation.
Thank you, Nicole.
Good evening, everybody. Ray Paris, who is an assistant professor of creative writing here at MSU, and I drove across the country this summer. On the way, and part of Ray's project of understanding, quote, how we preserve the past and present and how our fictions about the past inform and shape our disturbing and violent present, we stopped in Topeka, Kansas, and visited Monroe Elementary School, the black school attended by children central to the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case. As a black, biracial person myself, my father is a black Jamaican, my mother a white American, I thought a lot while at Monroe about the ways so-called integration has always been one way, and assimilate into whiteness, spaces, and knowledges, or fail enterprise. They weren't busing white kids into black schools and firing white teachers. I was reminded of the great Gloria Ladson-Billings comment a couple years back, I'd rather have a real Plessy than a fake Brown. Such assimilate or fail models persist. Last week, when the Ford Foundation started the hashtag #inequalityis, I tweeted, inequality is a schooling system serving a students of color majority remaining centered on white, middle class, monolingual norms of success. As you may know, fall 2014 marked the first time students of color are the majority in US public schools. In 1970, 80% of public school students were white. In 2015, more than 50% are students of color. That's an extraordinary shift. And yet US educational policy and practice continues to be centered largely on white, middle class, monocultural, and monolingual, as well as cis, hetero, patriarchal, ableist norms of educational achievement. How can we envision and enact pedagogies that meet the needs of the new mainstream? These are students of color characterized by multilingualism, multiculturalism, and the desire to strive toward equality in an unequal and shifting racially and ethnically diverse society. In my own work, I have engaged with others in the conceptual and empirical project of culturally sustaining pedagogy, teaching and learning that seeks to perpetuate and foster linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of the democratic project of schooling and as a needed response to demographic and social change. CSP builds on decades of crucial asset-based educational work that has countered pervasive deficit approaches, working against the backdrop of beliefs in white superiority and the systemic racism they engender, to prove that our practices and ways of being as students and communities of color are legitimate and should be included meaningfully in classroom learning. One crucial starting place for moving toward a culturally sustaining education is to think deeply about how we are situated in systems and spaces that perpetuate the curricularization of racism. And I'm building off Guadalupe Valdez's work on the curricularization of Spanish in US schools. The curricularization of racism names the ways systemic racialized discrimination remains a central part of the explicit and implicit teaching and curriculum of US schools. It is easy to see the curricularization of racism and differences in school push-out and graduation rates between, for example, white, black, and Latino students, massively disproportional discipline statistics, and the school-to-prison pipeline of which they are a part. As the US Department of Education civil rights data tells us, nationally, black students are 3.5 times as likely to be suspended as white students, and that 70% of students referred to law enforcement are black or Hispanic. This is all clear evidence of systemic privilege based on race as it plays out in educational settings. And obviously, there are intersections always with class, language, gender identity, sexuality, disability. But beyond these sorts of raw and stark statistics, I'm also interested in other forms, other ways and spaces that curricularize racism remains a bedrock of pre-K through university learning. For instance, the ways racialized language practices of students of color are suppressed through policy, practice, and ideology in pre-K through university classrooms. We might think about the suppression of Spanish in an era of English only, or about African American language, or about Anishinaabemowin, the language of the Great Lakes Native people. Or the ways canons of knowledge from literature to social science to science remain centered largely on white, middle class, monolingual, and male, cis, hetero, ableist norms of who, what, and how things can be known and done. These are often more implicit forms and spaces that racism is curricularized in educational institutions, how ways of using language, of thinking and believing, of acting, are actively silenced through what is studied and how, and the ways if you don't acquiesce to these racialized, class, gendered, and so on norms, you are deemed deficient and unworthy of places in classrooms, be they elementary ones or university ones. And of course, the curricularization of racism also names the places in which education happens. The deplorable conditions in many Detroit public schools, class sizes of 35 to 45 students, buildings unfit for living, let alone learning, toxic water in Flint that young people drank at home and at school. These too are aspects of systemic racial discrimination that disproportionately affect black and brown youth in public schools. They evidence the ways that educational racism and environmental racism continue to go hand in hand in the United States, starving the mind, body, and spirit at once. As I also tweeted in response to the Ford Foundation hashtag, inequality is an education system that says, we don't value you enough to provide clean water, safe buildings, and a sustaining curriculum. If we're going to sustain the new mainstream, then we must ask, how are we resisting this foundational curricularization of racism in our teaching and learning, and in the policies that constrain or liberate teaching and learning? In my local work here in Michigan, this resistance has looked like Anishinaabe school teacher Simon, who teaches his predominantly Anishinaabe 7th graders in the Upper Peninsula Anishinaabemowin language through conversation and a written curriculum he created, Anishinaabe history from Native perspectives, and Indigenous arts and drumming. Simon talks often about his modest goals for language and culture, where he traverses realities of only a handful of fluent Anishinaabewan speakers, and of the continued silencing of Anishinaabe ways of being in the official state curriculum and policy. And this resistance to curricularized racism has looked like English teacher Yvonne, herself of Black and Chinese heritage, working with her African American middle school students in Detroit to restore the neighborhood park. Yvonne shared with me her goals for the park project, and this is a picture of boys in her class at the park clearing garden beds for spring planting. When you look at the neighborhood, you wonder, do we have agency over our communities, over our houses? The state is taking over the city. Do we have agency? And I guess if students are able to really understand it, they would see that despite the takeover, the control over the black community, we have to do what we have to do. And that's creating our own gardens, having our own parks, fixing them, caring for it. Because if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. I believe such educative resistance to the pervasive curricularization of racism is part of joining young people and communities who have, through Black Lives Matter and other facets of the movement for racial justice, created a momentary fissure, working in embodied and digital spaces to help reform state-sponsored systems that continue to devalue and harm them. As students, educators, scholars, and leaders, we must join with these young people and community members to create learning spaces that center and sustain them and us. We must find ways to say, as Ray Paris wrote in the Open Letter of Love to Black students, which was signed by over 1,300 Black professors, we see you, we hear you, we love you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Angie Kennedy from the School of Social Work. My work focuses on young people, primarily adolescent girls and young women. I look at how poverty and violence shape things like mental health and school participation. My background directly influences my work. I grew up in a very small town in Iowa. For most of my childhood and adolescence, we were poor. I had a difficult home life and experienced some serious events, both of which had lasting effect on me. On the other hand, I had some members of my extended family who cared about me, including my grandparents who owned a farm. That's me in the middle with the dog and the horse and the goose in the background. School was a good place for me. Teachers encouraged me, and I felt competent and seen in a way that I didn't feel at home. As a white kid in a small town located in a rural state known for its good schools, I had access to a solid education. Importantly, my school and the community I lived in were both safe. I could walk to school and be safe. When I was in school, I was safe. I knew that doing well in school was my ticket out. I was the first person in my family to go to college. Once I was in college, my path or my trajectory completely changed. As we know, obtaining an education is no panacea, but it is the best chance to move out of poverty. So I experienced a lot of risks growing up, but I also had some good things going on that helped offset those risks. After earning my MSW, I worked in Chicago with young mothers who had dropped out of school to try to provide them with support so they could re-enroll and graduate. I saw their struggles, including the violence many of them experienced, not just in their families, but also in their neighborhoods and with their boyfriends. All of this trauma, combined with poverty, made it very difficult to focus on school, as you could imagine. On top of all that, their schools were terrible. Most of the young moms I worked with were either Mexican American or African American. Chicago neighborhoods and schools, like most other places, are segregated by race, ethnicity, and class, so poor minority neighborhoods were stuck with the worst schools. So unlike my situation growing up, many of the young women I worked with had to battle hostility or indifference in every setting they were in, along with the effects of the traumas they had experienced. As a result, very high rates of dropout were common. We know that experiencing violence, especially cumulative violence, as a child or an adolescent, is linked to poor school participation and dropping out. These, in turn, predict reduced earnings, thus perpetuating inequality. When I decided to enter a doctoral program during my PhD, I knew I wanted to study how different forms of violence influence dropout and school participation among young mothers. But I also wanted to better understand resilience, defined as competent, adaptive functioning despite exposure to risk. To be perfectly clear, fostering resilience in young people is not going to solve poverty or racial inequality or reduce violence. We need wide-scale policy changes and fiscal commitment to address those issues. But an understanding of resilience and how to foster it is still really important. First of all, detailing resilience among poor young mothers helps to challenge negative stereotypes about them. Second, it's a way to capture their agency instead of understanding them as passive victims of violence. Third, if we can figure out what factors seem to contribute to resilience among poor youth, we can then create programs that build off of those factors. So an interview study with young mothers that I conducted in Chicago revealed 5 different factors that seem to contribute to the resilience of some of the participants. The first thing was a strong goal or a future orientation. So even though they're in this really terrible situation in that moment, they can set goals and they can think about, I'm going to get out of this thing and I'm going to be able to move forward. The second thing is interpersonal intelligence or insightfulness, or able to make meaning. So they can think about the dynamics in their family and think about how they want to change things and make things different for their families and their children. Problem-solving ability and planfulness versus impulsivity. So they can be in these sort of really dire sort of crises and be able to think on their feet and be able to really be planful. Independence and determined to stand up for themselves. So they weren't willing to sort of accept the negative stereotypes about them and just, or accept the negative perceptions that their families may have about them. And finally, skillful at making connections with mentors and other supportive people. So they were able to find connections. One young woman was beaten by her mother, including when she was pregnant, but her godmother, who was her teacher in 4th grade, was this key support for her. And after her baby died, her godmother took her in, and she was staying with her when I interviewed her. Based on these factors, you can see how a mentoring program, for example, is an effective way to foster resilience. A mentor can be a powerful role model, providing emotional support and encouragement, helping to set goals and plan for the future, and so on. These opportunities can then increase the odds that poor youth who've experienced violence and other forms of adversity will finish high school and go on to college, thus increasing the likelihood they will exit poverty. For young moms, improving their odds improves their kids' odds too, of course. If, as a society, we keep going in the direction we have been, we will continue to have high rates of dropout among poor youth of color. The result will be greater inequality. So from my perspective, it makes sense to invest in supporting young people so they can live up to their full potential. And as a society, we can reduce inequality and embrace what is just and fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie.
Good evening. How is everybody? All right. My 8 minutes begins now. All right, so we're going to shift a little bit. And my experiences and my background is a little bit different from my colleagues here. I am an administrator at Michigan State University. I'm a lawyer by training and experience, and I am also a person who identifies as a black woman, and I decided tonight that I would talk with you not necessarily as an administrator, not necessarily as a black woman, but because my identity influences the work that I do, and oftentimes I find myself being the voice for others that cannot speak, being the voice for others who are oftentimes silenced by the environment that we all live and learn in. My voice is the one you're going to hear this evening. So we're going to talk about the art of shifting and the shifting response of black women in America. And so I love Maya Angelou, and I hope others of you perhaps do as well, because oftentimes it's her words that inspire us, even in those moments when we feel as though we can't take that next step. And so the art of shifting. Often in my lifetime, and I'm sure that's true for others of you, you find yourself adapting to your environment. You know, we've heard a little bit about the issues of income inequality. We heard about bias. We heard about curricularization of, racism. And we also heard about resilience. And I appreciate hearing about resilience because oftentimes it's what it is that allow us to get up the next day. And it is truly a result of our being a resilient people. Black women's varied experiences may lead them to perceive positive and uplifting qualities. And this is a quote taken from one of my colleagues here at Michigan State, Dr. Isis Settles. You know, because oftentimes our race, our gender, our group membership leads us to see difficulties and obstacles as well as positive and uplifting qualities. But these perceptions may also relate to psychological and physiological well-being, sometimes in the positive, sometimes in the negative. And I want to talk a little bit about the nature of inequality and the psychological toll. Racism, of course, continues to be a daily part of American culture. Racial barriers have been overwhelming, and they have a differential impact on those of us who may identify as being from an oppressed group. But also, we have found that racial discrimination has associated increased mental disorders in African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans, suggesting that racism itself can be a traumatic experience. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of research that informs us on what to do in those situations where we may face racial trauma. Very recently, I was reading some of the work done by Monica Williams, who's studying the link between racism and post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't oftentimes talk about racial conflict, racial tension, racial experience as perhaps falling in that class of post-traumatic stress disorder. In this particular instance, what she is referring to is race-based traumatic stress injury, or the emotional distress a person may feel after encountering racial harassment or hostility. But what she basically says, and what I have found, is there's not enough peer-reviewed research in this area. There's not enough research that we can rely on that best informs us on ways in which we can best respond to racial trauma. And so as a result of that, in some of the early work that was done, and this was in the early 2000s, and this was a book that was a result of the Voices Project, and this was a project on the lived experiences of black women in the United States. Shifting the Double Lives of Black Women in America. 2003 it was published, and it talked about the roots of shifting, and oftentimes I find myself doing this as a black woman. But I didn't know how to name it. I didn't know what to call it. I knew I had these experiences, and oftentimes it's just kind of this disquieting moments of uncertainty for myself, depending on the spaces that I was in, whether it was in school, whether it was in college, whether it was in my professional environment. And we often find ourselves, and in this case, the Voices Project, which involved interviewing over 300 black women, who find themselves hiding their true selves and shift to accommodate differences in class, gender, and ethnicity. What I'm showing you here are the masters of shifting in my life. Lottie and Harriet Butler, my great-great-great aunts who were former slaves. My grandmother, Cecil Butler, and my mother, Kathleen Butler, both of whom were domestic workers who further refined the art of shifting and passed the legacy of shifting to me. What has come out of the Voices Project was the identification of 6 coping strategies, and I'm just going to talk about those briefly, and then perhaps in the point where we have some opportunities to talk, we can go into some of those details. Battling the myths. Black women often alter their behavior in order to disprove or transcend society's misconceptions about them. Defeating the myths of inferiority. Trying to avoid perhaps being referred to as angry when you express disagreement. Scanning, surveying, scrutinizing the environment. Think about this. Black women shift by constantly assessing the biases that we talked a little bit about earlier, prejudices they face, and think about the best way to respond. Making split-second decisions on whether to challenge an opinion. Do I stay late in the office, work overtime to disprove the myth about work ethics? Speak up when I hear a racist joke or offensive comment, or let it go because you don't want to be perceived as angry. Speaking up, the risks are great. Second guessing how you are responding to something, responses or reactions of colleagues, and not turning off your thinking, because this is where there may be some hidden meaning behind something that's been said. This is exhausting. There's a high effort in coping. It can be costly to one's health. Hypertension, we all talk about high blood pressure. It's a risk factor for heart disease. Walling off the impact of discrimination by downplaying, ignoring the role of racism, sexism in our lives. How do we transcend the pain and suffering? By walling it off. And of course, speaking spiritual and emotional support through our churches, religious communities, family and friends, often by finding that higher purpose, finding community where one can perhaps be sheltered from the storm. And of course, retreating to the black community and abiding by the home codes, because we often find when we return to our black community for relief and solace, we're often faced with pressure to abide by a different set of cultural conventions and codes. Okay? And we can talk about that a little bit later if you're interested. Shifting to satisfy the broader society and battle myths, stereotypes, changing how one looks or behaves to accommodate the varying codes of race, class, and gender can be not only exhausting, but chaotic. And for some black women, it amounts to fighting back. Consciously decide no longer content to simply suppress negative emotions and are ready to take on the task of educating and challenging others. Educating by finding our voice, educating by insisting that we be heard, and sometimes by coercing, influencing ways in which we can have these difficult conversations about these issues. Fighting back can be a very rich coping strategy. The nature of inequality, the need to shift persists. The experiences of women of color, their related stories have not yet been told or adequately researched. Black women's experiences based on racial and gender identities may have benefits, material resources, a sense of pride, but is likely to also be associated with negative psychological and physiological outcomes, the nature of inequality.
Thank you, Paulette. Now, I should offer that we're actually privileged to have several people that follow the entire forum and have a chance to talk with me at times and have expressed interest in the panelists being able to have more time, and do know that you are heard. And part of why we do this is we know we're not going to solve any of the problems that we throw out, right? And we want to encourage dialogue. We want to encourage you in the community, you in the audience, to reach out to our panelists and keep the conversations going, whether it's this topic or any other topic. And so we do recognize that. I want to share with you kind of some gems that I took away from each and some overarching themes, and then see if the panelists want to comment on each other, and then from there, we'll open it up to you. As I listened to Charlie, it struck me that in 1 century, not only have we not gotten rid of inequality, but it actually has increased some, despite some efforts to make it go the other way. And while there's the narrowing of the income, the gap in income for women, it struck me that just this morning I heard a news report that women actually pay more for products than men if you look at the same products. So maybe the income gap is widening, but if you charge women more for the very same products, then what difference does it really make? Also, thinking about the intersectionalities between gender and race, how does that play out? And if the pendulum has swung once, when and if do we anticipate it will swing again? How far? What do we do to capitalize on that swing when it happens? And really being sensitive to the role of politics and social issues, which is hopefully doesn't fall on deaf ears in 2016. If I could be political for a moment, I think that as we're looking at a presidential election, we need to pay attention to what does that mean for us. As I listened to Nicole talk about a different type of widening of the gap, what occurred to me is the importance of learning about our own biases. How do we uncover and deal with implicit bias and not just say it's there, so what, and move on? And what's the role of society, peer groups, the media, academia in not only shaping implicit bias, but also dismantling it, or at least finding a way to move forward? How do we confront privilege? How do we acknowledge our own privilege? I mean, you can be a part of a typically disadvantaged group and find yourself in a position of privilege. And how do you reconcile what that means? And really, what are our roles in higher education when it comes to addressing and unearthing implicit bias? Some things for us to think about. When I listened to Django and the conversation around integration and assimilation, you know, it's kind of scary that all these decades later, we still do it to new groups that come to join us. We still say, this is the model, and you must fit this model, and if you don't, something's wrong with you. So how do we also educate for and towards who we really are? Is there a way to accept all that humans and acknowledge that the fringes of differences don't matter? How do we challenge models and norms for educational achievement? What do we do to ensure that we have an asset-based approach, not just to education, but to all aspects of society? Do we begin to look at what people bring to the table as opposed to what we think they're lacking? And what's the importance of culturally sustaining education? We talk a lot about culturally sensitive education. What about culturally sustaining education? Angie's talk was really important for helping us think about creating safe spaces. And although she related back into being a youth and going through school, it's all of society. How do we create these spaces where people can be valued? Whether it's school, work, where we live, and again, what's the role of education in counteracting poverty? And if we know from all the data that education has a role to play, then aren't we think differently about how we approach education and what we expect out of education? And again, the adaptability and resilience. What are the qualities, characteristics, assets that allow people to succeed and overcome inequalities? We have an obligation to figure that out. And Paulette brought some of that out also, talking about the art of shifting and adapting. And you'll often hear a black woman talk about how adept black women and the black population, and I'm sure other groups that have had to adapt will talk about it as well, is all the hats that you wear. And how do you learn to wear those hats and teach others to wear the hats? Or guess what? Let's take them all off and just be who we are, right? How do we get to that point? How do our identities impact our perceptions and experiences? There was a study where undergraduates were put with faculty members to do research, and everything's shown that first-generation students, low-income students, students of color really value an identity connection when working with others. The faculty members in this study didn't think identity mattered, and it wasn't anything wrong with them. They just saw the student for who the student was and said, it doesn't matter what the subject is, I'm just going to work with the student. Yet there were certain students that said, who I am and how I got here shapes me. And the fact that that just wasn't known, we haven't had that conversation, we haven't taken the time to help people know that stories matter. And to think about PTSD. What do we do with the fact that we have huge parts of our population traumatized, and we're not figuring out how to help people cope, adapt, and recover? And how do we take some of those coping strategies from people who've been marginalized and play the game not only well, but probably better than others just to keep up, and make sure that there's a level playing field? And so when I listened across the different talks, what I heard was, how do we decide who's worthy or deserving? How do we confront assumptions and structures, be they political, social, economic, psychological? How do we deal with marginalization and systemic privilege? How do we value people? How do we help people live up to their potential? All of that's at the heart of inequality. It doesn't matter what scale of inequality you're looking at, that's all at the heart of it. And so part of why we bring you these different perspectives is so that when you leave here tonight, you have questions that you want to go and get answers to with a whole set of people. You want to keep the dialogue going. And so I want to ask my colleagues if there were things they heard from each other that they wanted to comment on or reflect on, and then you will have plenty of time to chat with them.
May I? Is this on? Charlie, can you talk a little bit more about, you were describing women and minorities and that there was a lessening of the gap? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
And in terms of income inequality?
The increase in income inequality is an increase in the gap between high-income households and middle and low-income households. Basically, the very top has pulled away from the top has pulled away from the middle has not pulled away from the bottom in the United States. But that's taking all households, regardless of race or family structure. But if you, so the part that I was talking about with regarding women was comparing earnings.
Okay.
And I was looking at the ratio, we take the median woman who works full-time year-round, compares and take her earnings in the labor market relative to the median man who works full-time year-round. And I remember actually the buttons when I was in college, 59 cents, because that was the number. It was a ratio of typically, it bounces around from year to year, but often in the high 50s was the ratio of the median woman to the median man back in the 70s. And now that's in the upper 70s. So that's, I would take that as a sign of progress. For African Americans, it's more complicated. The big increase for Black Americans happened before the period that I was focusing on mostly. Back in the first year that we have really good, pretty halfway decent racial data, 1939, the Black men and Black women were earning about 40% as much as their white counterparts. Now those ratios for Black women are in the low, for both men and women, for earnings it's in the low 80s, but then when we look at all of the things that go into household, I don't want to get too far afield, so stop me, Cynthia, when you need to stop me. But basically, for Black households, there's been a huge lessening of the gap, a huge improvement for middle-class Southern Blacks, which is a large fraction of the African American population. Some improvement for middle class, for the middle deciles of the income distribution in the rest of the country, although not nearly as good. The improvement has come mostly in the South. In this part of the country, African Americans have lost ground relative to their white counterparts throughout much of the income distribution in the last 40 years. We can talk about that more if we have time. But then I've talked about the middle doing pretty well nationally, driven by improvement in the South. But then at the top and the bottom, Blacks have not caught up to whites. At the top, you look at the folks at Goldman Sachs, not a whole lot of African American faces, and at the bottom, the disadvantaged neighborhoods that we've talked about some here. African Americans have lost ground to whites down at the bottom and up at the top, but not in the middle. They've gained a great deal of ground.
So it's safe to say the picture is mixed and we're not where we need to be.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's safe.
Other questions, comments among the panelists?
I found it interesting too, Charlie, just interesting in terms of people voting against their interests. And then you had mentioned that people, it was a post-Civil Rights Act that they were responding to. In some way, they were voting for what they thought their racial interests were.
Right.
To the continuing white superiority, and yet that happened to also go against their economic interests.
Yes, exactly. That race trumps, and I'm not sure if I should use that word, but race trumps economics.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is exactly the segment of the electorate that has consistently voted against their economic interests, and who Donald Trump is channeling very, very effectively. I mean, I believe, we could argue about it, but the thing that allowed him to capture the imagination, the first thing, I mean, he's done a lot of things lately. The first thing that allowed him to capture the imagination of this segment of the electorate was his repeated insistence, despite any evidence, that the President of the United States was not born in the United States. And that he didn't call him an N-word, he didn't call him all sorts of epithets that we could call President Obama, But this was the dog whistle message. This was the message that people, we cannot accept this man as legitimately the president. And Donald Trump is the only guy who is willing to say it. And that resonates.
So Charlie, you're giving a lot of airtime to the campaign.
that
And our
resonates
next
with a
session
portion of
is-
the electorate.
It's all politics. So we're going to save that discussion for April.
All right.
And come back to inequality. Any other panelists, comments or questions?
I'm fine with hearing questions.
All right, so I believe Stephanie Cepak, who's communications manager from the Honors College and plays a big role in making sure everything goes right for this evening, is going to field questions for us. Raise your hand when you have a question and she'll make her way to you.
And I will just make one plug that if you want to join us for Future Sharper Focus Wider Lens, that there's a couple clipboards roaming. I know there's one back here where the cookies used to be, to sign up for the emails. So I believe I saw your hand.
Thank you. My question is primarily for Charles also, but you spoke of earnings and income, and my concern, I guess, at least one of my concerns is around wealth. Not income, not pay rates, not even minimum wage. It's the wealth disparity in this country. And maybe you could speak on how, as I was watching or looking at your slides, I tried to superimpose what I believe to be the wealth progression along that same timeline. And it's very interesting. And if you could speak on that.
So it's always been true that wealth is way, 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 way more unequally distributed than income. There's a statistic that economists use to measure these things, and it's called the Gini ratio. And I won't ask you. This is not a test. I won't ask anybody how to calculate it. But rough orders of magnitude for income, the Gini ratio in the U.S. went up from about 39 to 48, while the wealth ratio went up from about 85 to 90. And 100 is the most 100 says that Bill Gates has all the wealth. So a Gini of 90 is astonishing. Well, for wealth, the bottom half of the households have no wealth. Anybody who's living from paycheck to paycheck, you know, you've got $17.14 in your pocket. That's zero wealth. Then you get to people like probably most of us at this table who we've probably got some home equity. We've probably got TIAA craft pension. We might be worth a few $100,000. And that's a tiny drop compared to those at the very, 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 very top. And then there is a black-white dimension to this. The black wealth is, blacks have very little wealth, except for a very small number of folks. And there's a big racial element to that, but most whites don't have any wealth. So it's across the board. And we've undertaken a lot of policies that sort of have exacerbated the income inequality and wealth inequality, both important.
So after the question up here, there's a question to my right.
For Professor Ballard, it seems like, is it really that when we went on Keynesian economics with Franklin Roosevelt, you had your compression, then when Ronald Reagan took us back to supply side economics, Say's law, trickle-down economics, we went back to the gap that we had to 29. What's the status of Keynesian economics in academia today? And can you have an economic system that can explain the global marketplace, the global economy we have now?
Sorry, folks.
You're doing the elevator speech version of this, right?
Yeah. Virtually all economists are Keynesians at one level or another. Virtually all of us believe that it is possible for government fiscal policies to affect GDP growth and things like that. But when I looked to the Great Compression and the Great Divergence, I see the macro policies as only a very, very small part of it. I think the big, not zero, but small. I think the big thing is these other things. Think about the things that happened in Roosevelt's administration: National Labor Relations Act, and Fair Labor Standards Act, Social Security Act. There was an explosion of educational opportunity, K through 12 growth, and then the GI Bill of 1944. All of those policies pushed, and those were all sort of microeconomic policies. Those were trying to do things at the level of the individual household, and they worked to a large extent to reduce inequality, and then there was a reversal of those. And I think Franklin Roosevelt is the poster child for one of those sets of policies, and Ronald Reagan is the poster child for the reversal, although there are plenty of other fingerprints on it.
So if you, the importance in addressing a problem is framing it and getting the problem right so you can actually address it. And I think that for me, the problem lies in this insatiable greed on the part of a small minority of the populace, manipulating all the tools of society to acquire their ends, which is unfulfilled. You can never fill it up because they just can't get enough. And there's a program on television called Hoarders. Okay, you're probably all aware of that. And we view those people as sick, right? But what is greed that can't be satisfied, in which you take greed or everything from your fellow citizens in society? So I'm wondering to what degree, if we change the language and the focus, just like we did with cigarettes, what the women did with the women's movement in changing language to address things so that they're viewed differently, and if we actually declared this kind of insane pursuit of astronomical wealth as a form of mental illness, and change the dialogue and the perception as not something that should be glorified and pursued, but as something that should be rejected and socially thrown out as something evil in society.
Yeah.
Was that a question?
So first, was that something that you wanted the panelists to respond to, or did you want it to stand on its own?
So we have the gentleman there that deals with language and perception, and this and politics, they all intertwine to affect how society views things, how we pursue things. I mean, our society is so geared on marketing that we're marketed everything, including how we view society and wealth and what is right and wrong. And so I think that the dialogue, in my opinion, needs to change. We need a dialogue on what the problem is, and this problem
Right.
deals with poverty, it deals with wars, it deals with all sorts of inequalities, and it's a small segment throughout history.
Right.
We never really discussed that.
I mean, I think it was discussed in many different ways, in some ways, right? I mean, what Nicole was talking about in terms of, implicit bias and the ways that she was discussing how who we value, what we value, who we don't value, and what we don't value are messaged, right? Are part of the ideological soup in which we swim. So I mean, I think it has been talked about some. One thing that I think is interesting, though, just in terms of our conversation, is I think a lot of times we use talking about and thinking about class inequality as a way to escape directly talking about race and racism, or directly talking about gender bias or sexism, or directly talking about heteronormativity or homophobia. And so I think it's interesting to think, sometimes it's easier to talk about lots of people are rich and some people are poor. I mean, lots of people are poor and few people are rich than it is to talk about some of the ways that many of us in this room experience inequality on a daily basis and resist it.
We have a question here in the middle.
And I just want to remind everyone that we're live streaming, so it's really important that all of the comments come through the mics.
Thanks. Thank you all for speaking. My question comes from what Dr. Kennedy was saying about resilience, but really applies to, I think, all of your points, because I love the concept of resilience and I love the work that you're doing in social work, but I've seen a lot recently about how problematic the concept of resilience is, and especially, Paulette, when you were talking about shifting, and Dr. Buchanan, you were talking about the ways in which people deal with biases and microaggressions, and Dr. Paris, you were talking about creating maybe a system in which those things aren't necessary. And I think about the Halloween nonsense that happened at Yale and things like that that are like, the response to people, how do you deal with individuals building up resistance to the things that could cause them PTSD without the backlash of, the world at large saying that millennials and beyond are whining babies?
So at first when you were talking about the trickiness of resilience, I thought you were talking about the dangerousness sort of saying, oh, they're resilient, they'll be fine. We don't have to worry about them. We don't have to put any funding into programs or supports. Is that what you were?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to yell for the...
Sorry, I came over here.
No, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
I think it's a little bit of both. Is it more important to create a world in which, or can we simultaneously create a world in which people do not need to develop that level of resilience and simultaneously increase individuals' resilience so that they can exist in the world that we have?
Yes, I think ideally, I mean, a critical, and I tried to make that clear but I'm not hanging everything on resilience. Like, let's don't worry about structural issues, or let's don't worry about racism or wealth inequality or violence. I think for something to be effective with kids in a very practical way, you have to reduce the risk and you have to increase or facilitate the protective processes that foster resilience. You have to do both of those things. So we don't just want to say, yeah, let's just keep all the risks happening. Let's just throw everything at these kids and help these kids with a mentor. But on the other hand, you have to, there are going to be some challenges that we are all going to face. And we can't, it's like trying to balance out like what's just and what's equitable and I think we're at this moment, I'm kind of rambling. Sorry, I think we're at this moment where what's going on with college campuses among youth is all these things bubbling up, and young people, young adults are kind of taking this mantle on, and they're battling, and the pushback that they're getting is like, you're just a whiny baby. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think that it's really sort of the next civil rights era.
Yeah.
And that they're grabbing onto these challenges and battling and grappling and saying, we need safe spaces, we need all these things, because they're right, because it's just, and it makes sense. So we can't eliminate all risks, but we need to facilitate resilience, but that's not going to solve all these structural issues that I think that young people especially are grabbing a hold of and saying, we demand change, and they're right. That's my very rambling.
If I may, and although this is obvious, I feel like we need to directly say it. The bottom line is these things are very complicated.
Yeah.
That we can't take a simple approach and say, well, we'll fix schools and we'll do it by pouring money into schools, because that's not enough. We have to address the neighborhoods kids are reared in. We have to address structural problems with buildings. We have to look at the plumbing systems and how water is filtrated and brought into the schools, and how books are designed, marketed, and who they represent and who they don't. These issues become so incredibly complicated, and that's what's reflected in your question. There is no simple answer. What we absolutely do need is multiple people looking at things from multiple perspectives and taking on a variety of different lenses. This is part of why the kind of synergy that this stage represents can be so powerful, because we don't come from similar perspectives or fields. And we're all doing things that are quite necessary to move the field forward.
I think the only other comment that I would offer is when I said earlier that it's chaotic and exhausting. It truly is. You know, when you're living in space where you're confronted with some of the things that our students have been talking about, it's not okay. They are not whining. They are not asking to be coddled. They recognize that in life experiences, you're going to bump into things that can be offensive, but that there's a point at which we have a responsibility to say, it's not okay. Yes, the First Amendment is there. Yes, we can talk about freedom of expression, but you also have to understand that the exercise of that freedom is going to elicit a response, and it has an impact. And so is it essential to say it in that particular way? Maybe it is, maybe it is not. But if we can't engage in the kind of hopeful discussion we're having here, you know, it's just going to continue to perpetuate itself. And the structural changes that will be important to address inequality, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add too on this point about thinking about, you know, what is represented in these contemporary racial and cultural justice movements on campuses, is that it's important not to see it ahistorically, right? To remember that it was in the late 1960s and 1970s that undergraduates, right, in places like San Francisco State and Berkeley, San Jose State, Laney College, were at the front, right, and this was African American, Latino, Indigenous, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and white students who were in solidarity with them. Coalitional movements to say, we need to change how we think about knowledge on campuses, right? This was the development of ethnic studies as disciplines. This was the first time that many people on this stage would have even been on college campuses, allowed to be on college campuses, right? So we have to think of these things kind of historically and think about who's been included and when, what brought about that sort of inclusion and valuing, and how can we take that much further, realizing that wealth and income inequality is so important. Those inequalities, as they turn on and relate to race, right, gender and gender identity, sexuality, class, ability, and disability, which is something that we haven't touched on, right, and all those sort of axes of identity.
We have a question over here.
Thank you for taking the time to do this. This is really awesome, actually. My question is directed to Dr. Paris and Dr. Buchanan. Is that? But also open to the whole panel. Buchanan? Buchanan? Okay, sorry. But I guess the question is, how identities impact perception and experiences, and also the role of social and mainstream media in shaping and dismantling implicit biases. It reminds me of an analogy that this author, Basarab Nicolescu, drew on of ecosystems being more sustainable with more species. The more species it has, the more sustainable it is. So in natural science, we see an observation where diversity is valued. And even Darwin had said that one of humanity's as a species best advantages or advantages is our capacity for empathy. So how can we participate as actors in shaping the structures also, and sort of speaking to Dr. Paris's last comment on the history and, political representation, acknowledging the minorities' participation in the history of America. How can we today participate in social media as peers and help to sort of allow the representation of minorities to represent themselves to help bridge this gap? I guess, if that makes sense.
Well, I come to this question with a particular lens in that a lot of the work I do is very much rooted in the idea of thinking about these things as being dynamic, having to happen at multiple levels, and involving multiple fronts. So part of the work happens in dealing one-on-one with one another and getting to the point where we've developed relationships with people across difference so that we have some investment in how our mutual lives move forward. So that's one of many, many steps. we also need to understand that we are going to have different roles. There will be individuals who their gift will be in instruction and in helping individuals learn how to dismantle bias by working and teaching and instructing in that manner. But there will be other people who are able to help dismantle bias by addressing financial solvency and helping communities to become activist and move forward in these ways, so much like community psychologists might do. So there's going to be very, very different ways. One of the things I did not get to talk about is also the role of allies. So allies are traditionally thought of as those individuals who do not themselves identify or embody a social identity, but they have taken it upon themselves to become educated and to speak up in defense of those groups, whether or not members of those groups are there. And this would mean if you hear a homophobic joke, that regardless of your own sexual identity, you say something in the moment about the nature of that joke, that it's inappropriate, that it's offensive, that does not represent your values. And allies, it turns out, are much more effective often than if I were to speak. So when my white allies make a comment to other whites about a racist joke, that goes much further than if I say something about that same racist joke. And so looking at how can we all, because we all kind of belong to these matrices of power and privilege, where we are sometimes privileged and sometimes simultaneously marginalized, how do we all develop our allyship? How do we step up and be brave and say the things that need to be said, even when it's not necessarily in our own best interests, because we're not members of that group? And how do we commit ourselves to doing that every time, being consistent? It's frightening, but allies are deemed more legitimate. Their message is more likely to be believed. They are seen as less biased, as more intelligent and articulate in talking about issues. There's something that we give to those people that we would deem allies, those that are privileged group members that speak up and speak out on behalf of the groups that they don't themselves represent. And I think one of the things that we can all commit to doing is learning more about how to be an ally, taking up the charge, and then acting on that, even if we're sloppy at it at first.
I mean, just quickly to build on that point around allyship. So I work in teacher education, and upwards, of 80% of our teaching force are white middle class women, and as I said, the demographics of students, have become a majority of color. So thinking about fostering allyship is quite important, right? When I do a survey of my teacher education classes, which might be 25 students, again, maybe 80 to 90% white, mostly middle class, of what they read in high school, for instance, almost always they read hardly anything by African Americans, hardly anything by Latinos, hardly anything by LGBTQ people. When we start talking about intersections, it really falls off. Hardly anything by people that dealt explicitly with or was by a person with a disability, right? And so the exposure to representations, right, needs to start really early, right? We're talking pre-K and then all the way through. So that's one issue. I also think it's important to think about places where demographic change has caught up in terms of political change, like say San Francisco in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles, or in a reverse way in some ways in Arizona, where but for instance, in San Francisco, where now all high school students are required to take ethnic studies classes, right, in public schools. This has a lot to do with who the community is in San Francisco and how they've pushed for this over time. there's been recent research that's shown that students who, particularly students of color and poor students of color, who would have been predicted to do very poorly in school, possibly dropping out, when they are enrolled in ethnic studies classes, they don't only do well in the ethnic studies classes, they do well in every other class too. Better than they would have, by far better than what they would have been predicted to do. There's research that shows the same thing in Arizona. So we're talking about ways that we can really change what it is we study, who we value in that study, and what that can do, even on standard measures of achievement, and much beyond that in terms of the sort of allyship, the sort of broader understanding that Dr. Buchanan was talking about.
All right, please do raise your hand so I can see and come back around. I've got a question
There's
here, and
several
then we'll
coming
come
up
back.
front.
Hi. So I find it amazing that as we're sitting in here having this intellectual conversation, at the same time tonight across town at East Lansing High School, there's a school board meeting going on that's dealing with some of these same issues, but in a very practical sense. And what has happened in East Lansing, and I'm directing this to Dr. Paris specifically, but to any of you, East Lansing voted several years ago to close our only majority minority school, Red Cedar.
Right.
And it was a very high-performing school that was the example of cultural competence that you talk about in your lecture. And recently, the new school board and new superintendent voted to reopen that school. The backlash against that vote has been particularly intense,
Right.
very, very mean-spirited. So I guess my question is, how do we deal with an effort to recapture a truly excellent example of a school that was culturally competent, and it's being undermined by basically the wealthy white populations that want to preserve their own schools?
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a direct answer for just kind of how to do that. But I will say just briefly that Ray and I taught at ASU for 3 years before we were here, and that was at the time when HB 2281 was passed, and that was the ethnic studies ban, right? And so you had a very successful program, ethnic studies program, Mexican American studies program in the Tucson Unified School District, predominantly at Tucson High School, for instance, and other schools, predominantly Latino schools. The population of people under 25, say, is massively predominantly people of color. When you go over 50, right, it's much more predominantly white. You may know something about that, but the program was shut down, right? Even though, right, it was achieving on standard measures and many other measures, and so. I guess one thing to say would be, and they've continued to work, and there's a new version of that program now in Tucson Unified School District, is to continue to hold up what happened in those educational spaces and who's losing and how, because they're no longer there, to continue to educate young people so that when they grow up, and this includes obviously white young people, when they grow up, they won't have those same values. And they'll want to embrace educational settings like that. So I'd be really happy to talk kind of more specifically with you about this. But I think one of the things is to show what value it had for whom, and to be quite explicit, and also to marshal some research on your side, right? So we have all this research that says that could really help and say, actually, because I really love the idea of local control in so many ways, which there isn't in many communities, like right now in DPS. And yet, when local control does something like this, right? And so marshal some of the research and some of our colleagues, in teacher education and at the College of Education.
I'm going to come up here.
If we can help.
I was part of the Occupy movement, and we had 99% as our theme. but lots of people didn't join in. We did have diversity. We had, you know, white, pink, blue-collar workers and felons and, you know, people. But it's very hard to maintain any kind of homogeneity, and we were criticized and harassed out of existence by the white power structure, the systemic thing that's going on. And of course, the rich people didn't mind owning 85% of the wealth, and people did not vote according to their wishes. So, I mean, I was holding hands singing "We Shall Overcome" back in the 60s, and we thought we did so well with civil rights, housing rights, voting rights, and affirmative action. And then they passed the new Jim Crow drug laws, 800% increase in incarceration, black bread and brown breadwinners getting pulled off to prison, 800% rise in incarceration. And now we have people of color experiencing traumatic stress every single day that they walk into this racist society. It's not post-traumatic, it's present traumatic stress. So I just wonder, you know, with civil, Citizens United and, you know, so many other things that are so systemic. I mean, do we sign on to Black Lives Matter and My Brother's Keeper? I mean, what are some positive ways to build up a new system? Because you can't just tear down the old system, right? You gotta have some kind of vision or some kind of hope or some kind of effort to build up something that works better. So any of you have ideas about that?
There's no silver bullet. I think it's going to take a combination of things, whether it is continuing to have forums like this, whether it's ways in which individuals, you know, choose to activate within their own communities and be the good allies that we've been talking about here. It's pushing ourselves to step outside what makes us most comfortable. You know, you heard at the early start of this Project 6050, we started that, you know, in 2014 to engage in conversations around civil and human rights, year-long, 200 programs, 10,000 people participated in those programs. The decision was made to sustain that because we recognize these conversations have to take place, because rooted within those conversations are opportunities to do certain things. You know, is it laws? Is it challenging laws? Is it redistribution of wealth? Is it, you know, I don't know that I can point to any one thing and say, this has worked, this has worked, this has worked. It's just something that's, somebody else up here must have a better response than I do. So.
Well, I'm going to tag on to your response and say yes, yes, yes. Right? Is it laws? Yes. Is it programs? Yes. Is it aligning yourself with social movements that matter? Yes. Is it leveraging your own privilege and power? Yes. You know, are you an employer? Are you a supervisor? Are you someone who can network with others? What are we doing in our own circles of influence to change the dynamics, right? What comes to mind to me is an anonymous poem, and I'm not going to get it right. Some of you will know it, but it talks about the person that when they came for the Jews, I did nothing. And it goes through a litany of groups. And it says, when they came for me, there was no one left, in essence, right? And so at what point, you know, which group are we going to say, whether it's for self-interest or not, no, you can't dismantle that group, right? You can't attack that group. And we have to fight within the system and externally. So, you know, during the civil rights movement, there was a big debate about, you know, are you a part of the establishment or are you the radical? Well, it takes both, right? You have to leverage wherever you are, and you have to know your own mechanism for influencing change, right? And so we can't just expect it to happen in laws, but if we want laws to be effective, then we have to vote smartly, right? We can't believe the founding fathers that said essentially we were uneducated mass. Right? We need to go out and educate ourselves and vote smartly. We need to spend our dollars smartly about who are we supporting, what businesses do we believe in, and we need to do things in our community that matter. And it's all of those pieces. It goes back to Nicole's comment that it's complex. And if we're looking for one thing to solve it, 5 generations from now is going to be having the same conversation, right? And so we have to weigh in where we are, and then we have to step a little bit beyond where we are and take a chance to take a bullet, right? And that might be a literal bullet, right? Or it might be, you know, a political bullet, but be willing to step into some difficult places, because if we don't do it, who will, right? And so that's the solution, is it's all hands in.
If I may, there was a comment earlier about the greedy folks. The greedy folks will always be greedy. They always have been. They always will be. They will be stopped if someone stops them. And in our system, the most effective way of stopping them is to vote. And I noticed that in Michigan, for instance, the number of people who voted in 2008 and 2012 was about 800,000 more than the number who voted in 2010 and 2014. We get what we vote for, or rather, we get what we don't vote for. And so one thing, you're looking for ways to act, knock on doors at election time. This is going to be a very important election in 2016. I wanted to draw attention to one possible alliance. We've talked about allies. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose birthday was last week, the Reverend, he was a preacher. And there was, in the 60s when I was growing up, there was an alliance that included, among other things, black churches and white churches. And I go to a church where there's a sign on the billboard, God loves everybody, no exceptions. There's a potential alliance there. As we know, the most segregated hour in American society is 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. But there are alliances that could take place. And I remember the comment of John Kerry's organizer in Ohio in 2004, which you'll remember that John Kerry lost Ohio in 2004 and thus lost the election. They said, oh, we don't do white churches. Well, I think we should do all kinds of churches. There's lots, and certainly faith communities are not the only avenue through which change can be affected, but I think that they're one that often progressives sort of dismiss, because of course there are people of faith who think that the only real true evidence of your faith is to hate gays and lesbians. But there are lots of people of faith who have egalitarian and progressive views, and that's a group I think that has not been exploited to the fullest.
I saw 2 hands raised up here front.
This question goes out to anyone for whom this question is relevant. So last fall, we saw the Supreme Court revisited a court case by Abigail Fisher regarding affirmative action programs in universities, and some newspapers have speculated 3 possible outcomes: that they might just toss away the case completely, or they might strike down affirmative action programs in UT Austin, or they might strike down affirmative action programs all across the country. Now the third case, this is a bit of a speculation. If that does happen, what measures can universities take to eliminate implicit bias and carry out their admissions policies such that students from marginalized communities are benefited and that they can get an education and break this vicious cycle of poverty and racial and systematic inequality, which still does exist?
I'll say briefly. We live in the state of Michigan that has a Prop 2, which basically, to the extent that Grutter-Gratz in 2003 declared that it was still constitutional to consider race as one of many factors. We live in a state that says we can't discriminate, which of course I said that historically has been the law, both in the land and in the state, but also granting preferential treatment on the basis of. So we live in a state where, you know, Texas may go and other states have already been. Implicit bias has, you know, there's no granting of preferential treatment in the same way, potentially, if we're developing people's understanding of the fact that we all possess biases and that those biases advantage some and disadvantage others. It's recognizing the way in which I act on my biases. And so, you know, I don't worry as much. I do worry about the Supreme Court saying there's no educational benefit in having a diverse campus community, which I don't think they're going to do. But I'm always the optimist because I, you know, benefited from affirmative action. And so I don't think they're going to upset the precedent that has been in place since the Bakke decision in '78. I think they're going to hold true to that. What they're going to do is refine even further under what circumstances you can consider race.
And I would just add to that deep legal knowledge over there that I do not have. So I also benefited from affirmative action. When Ray and I went to Berkeley, there was about 15%, it was like 15% black. Now it's something like 1.5 after Prop 209 passed and there was no longer affirmative action at UC schools, right? It changed the complexion of the campus. And so these are big stakes, you know, so the American Educational Research Association, of which I'm a part, put together an amicus brief to Marshall Educational Research, which talks about the benefit of diversity for all learners, and has, you know, has supplied that in the case, in the Fisher case. But I would also say we have to continue to think about ways that our programs, right, this could be in businesses, but here at universities as well, that our programs, right, like if we have the Urban Educators Cohort Program in the College of Education, that says something about particular values, and it attracts particular faculty and students also, right? People working to be allies, people who are members of groups of color themselves, people who have been, you know, involved in urban education and all. So there's ways to develop spaces or particular jobs, right, within departments that don't say this is only for X, Y, or Z, but also say it's this field that we're looking for and that we need knowledge in. And that can help attract, you know, and continue to make this place, as well as many other universities, places that can welcome everyone.
The bottom line strategy has been you make whatever it is that you're doing more inclusive. Okay, so to the extent that it's important to preserve those programs that target populations that have historically been underrepresented, then you don't throw the program out, you expand participation in that program. So to the extent that men are more interested in advocating for the increased participation of women in STEM, you want to participate in a program that targets that population? Come on. When we talk about allies, that's what we're looking for. So.
I have a direct question for Dr. Buchanan and also Ms. Gregory-Russell. So I really like the idea of shifting, and even as a white woman, I can really relate to having to do that in my daily life. And it sort of also reminded me, like you were saying, about implicit things that you don't even necessarily realize that you're doing, especially to yourself. And so I was just wondering what you thought were ways that we could be allies for people to make it so they don't have to feel like they have to shift through these roles and cycle through these different roles in their life. And then also, do we need to pick one way to shift, or how can we best achieve this neutrality? And if so, how do we determine what our neutrality is?
You want to start?
When you say neutrality, would you mind telling me what you are meaning that to say?
The best possible fit that doesn't have to be shifted.
My first response is shifting isn't a bad thing. In fact, if we liken it to other things, so black folks, we call it I'm blanking on the word all of a sudden.
Code switching.
Code switching, thank you. But also if you look at immigrant populations, we talk about people being bicultural, and we know that the bicultural identity is actually quite protective because individuals are able to function better within both settings, and so they flourish and they do better than people that are isolated within one or the other. So perhaps more than trying to reduce the shift, reduce switching, that we instead create tolerance for it, that we actively work. You know, if you see me, I'm a big salsa dancer, if you see me out in the club, I'm a very different person than I am here, I'm a very different person than I am at home. Can there be space for elements of those portions of me to show up in the different settings that I am in? Does it have to be unprofessional if I talk about black folks in a little different way for a moment and kind of get out of my professor garb for a second? Can that be okay? Can we make room for that? I think if people are allowed to let more of who they are entirely in these different settings, that will naturally be more healing than where we are now. But I personally think, and do actively teach, how to do a little bit more of that code switching. So I don't think it's a bad thing.
And I was, you know, what I want people to appreciate is that sometimes the shifting is, it is abandoning your authentic self, and that's the exhausting part of it. And so it's done out of a sense of survival. And so my retreat is often finding my sisters who appreciate and understand what's happening today, and I can close my door and I can say, girl, you know? And they say, yeah, girl, I know. And I have white women friends who understand the coping that's going on. And so it is, by putting it out there, and making individuals in this space aware that this is the sort of thing that happens. You know, when you're sitting with women and you're in a meeting or you're in a classroom and you're fighting for airspace, or you raise your hand and you're not being acknowledged, or what you say isn't acknowledged until someone else says it, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, that was the greatest thing that anyone could have said, and it just happened to be a white male, even though you said it 20 minutes ago. It's creating space to say, for example, well, you know, appreciate that you said that, John, but it seems that I heard Amy as she was making that statement a bit earlier. And so it's acknowledging and affirming that this is something that was said. And so it's beginning to, I think at some point it makes it easier for us when we have those moments that I know someone else has my back. You know what's going on. So.
I appreciate all the questions, and I know that we probably have lots more, and we're drawing to a close. And we acknowledge there's lots of populations that didn't get airtime today, and so we put that out there, and it's not because those populations aren't important. They just didn't surface in the conversation, which means we have to have more conversations, right? Want to remind everyone that our next Sharper Focus Wider Lens is on April 18th, 7 p.m., same place. And the topic is, it's all about politics. I think I'm safe in saying that the panelists will hang around for a few minutes. If you have questions, you can come and approach them and ask them directly. And thank you all for being with us tonight. We really appreciate your participation.